Right now, at this very moment, your brain is lying to you. Not maliciously, not consciously, but systematically, predictably, and in ways that have been hardwired into your neural architecture over millions of years of evolution. You believe you see the world as it is. You believe your memories are accurate recordings of past events. You believe your decisions are the product of careful, logical reasoning. You are wrong. Welcome to the hidden world of cognitive bias, the invisible architecture that shapes every thought you think, every decision you make, and every belief you hold dear.
This is the story of how the most sophisticated computing device in the known universe, the human brain, consistently tricks itself, and why understanding these tricks might be the most important knowledge you ever acquire.
Meet confirmation bias, perhaps the most pervasive and dangerous of all cognitive distortions. It's the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Imagine Sarah, a manager who believes one of her employees, Tom, is lazy. When Tom arrives early to work, she thinks he's just trying to make a good impression. When he stays late, she assumes he's inefficient and can't finish his work on time. When he takes a sick day, it confirms her suspicion that he's unreliable. Meanwhile, her favorite employee, Jennifer, exhibits identical behaviors, but Sarah interprets them completely differently. Arriving early shows dedication, staying late shows commitment, and taking a sick day means she's genuinely ill and probably worked herself too hard. Our brains evolved this way because in the ancestral environment, quickly categorizing things as safe or dangerous, friend or foe, was more important than nuanced analysis. The gazelle that stopped to reconsider whether that rustling in the grass might just be wind instead of a lion didn't pass on its genes. But in our modern world, where complex problems require us to genuinely consider alternative viewpoints, confirmation bias turns us into intellectual echo chambers, surrounding ourselves only with information that tells us we're right, making us increasingly certain about things we should question, and increasingly divided from those who see the world differently. A real estate agent shows a couple a house. The asking price is $850,000, she says with a knowing smile. The couple gasps, it seems high, but now every subsequent house they see will be judged against that number. A $700,000 house suddenly seems like a bargain, even though they'd planned to spend only $600,000. This is anchoring bias, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions. In one famous study, researchers asked participants to spin a wheel that randomly landed on either 10 or 65, then asked them to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who saw 10 guessed around 25%. Those who saw 65 guessed around 45%. Retailers exploit this mercilessly. That $200 sweater marked down to $89.99. You feel like you're getting a deal, even though the sweater was never worth $200 and the store always intended to sell it for $90. The original price is just an anchor, making the actual price seem reasonable by comparison. Salary negotiations work the same way. Whoever throws out the first number sets the anchor, and all subsequent negotiations orbit around that initial figure. Our brains use anchoring as a cognitive shortcut, a starting point for estimation when we lack complete information. In a world of infinite data, we need somewhere to begin. But this mental efficiency comes at a cost. We become prisoners of arbitrary numbers, letting irrelevant information colonize our decision-making process, often without ever realizing we've been influenced at all. A mother watches the evening news, which leads with a story about a child abduction. She clutches her own child tighter, suddenly terrified to let him play outside. The statistics tell a different story. Child abductions by strangers are extraordinarily rare, and children are far more likely to be injured in car accidents on the way to school than kidnapped from a playground. This is the availability heuristic, our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or imagined. If examples come readily to mind, we assume they must be frequent. After watching Jaws, people became terrified of shark attacks, even though you're more likely to be killed by a falling coconut than a shark. After 9/11s, many Americans chose to drive instead of fly, leading to an estimated 1,600 additional road deaths in the year following the attacks, more than died in the planes themselves. But in our media-saturated age, this heuristic misfires constantly. Rare but dramatic events, terrorist attacks, plane crashes, lottery winners, receive disproportionate coverage, making them cognitively available even though they're statistically negligible. Meanwhile, common but undramatic killers, heart disease, diabetes, car accidents fade into the background of our awareness. We fear the spectacular and ignore the mundane, making decisions based not on actual risk but on the vividness of our mental imagery. We become walking collections of memorable anecdotes, mistaking the memorable for the meaningful, the dramatic for the dangerous, and the easily recalled for the genuinely important. A hiring manager reviews 2 resumes. Candidate A graduated from MIT with a degree in computer science, worked at Google, lists coding and algorithm optimization as hobbies. Candidate B graduated from a state school with a degree in English literature, worked in retail management, lists reading and hiking as hobbies. The manager needs to hire a software engineer. Without even looking at their actual qualifications or work samples, she assumes candidate A is the better fit. This is the representativeness heuristic, our tendency to judge the probability of something belonging to a category based on how similar it is to our mental prototype of that category. The manager is asking, how much does this person look like my mental image of a software engineer, rather than what evidence do I have of this person's actual abilities? In a famous study, psychologists described Linda, 31 years old, single, outspoken, very bright, majored in philosophy, deeply concerned with discrimination and social justice, and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then they asked, is it more likely that Linda is A, a bank teller, or B, a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement? Most people chose B, but this is mathematically impossible. The probability of 2 things being true together, bank teller and feminist, cannot be higher than the probability of just one of them being true, bank teller. People chose B because Linda represents their stereotype of a feminist more than their stereotype of a bank teller. The representativeness heuristic helped our ancestors make quick categorizations. That animal looks like the one that bit me, so I should avoid it. But it also makes us terrible at statistics, prone to stereotyping, and likely to ignore base rates and actual evidence in favor of surface similarity. We judge books by their covers, people by their appearances, and situations by their superficial resemblance to past experiences, often missing the deeper truth hidden beneath the representative surface. After a major event, talking heads line up to share their insights: a stock market crash, a political upset, a corporate bankruptcy. I saw it coming, they all say. The signs were obvious. Anyone paying attention could have predicted this. This is hindsight bias, the tendency to see past events as having been more predictable than they actually were. After something happens, we reconstruct our memories to make it seem like we knew it all along. Before the 2008 financial crisis, almost no one predicted it. After it happened, everyone claimed they saw it coming. Before Brexit, polls showed it was a toss-up. After it passed, people on both sides claimed the result was inevitable. Hindsight bias makes us overconfident in our ability to predict the future because we misremember our past predictions. In one study, psychologists asked people to predict the outcome of Nixon's 1972 visit to China and the Soviet Union. After the visits, they asked the same people what they had predicted. People consistently remembered having predicted what actually happened, even when their written predictions said something completely different. This bias serves a psychological function. It helps us maintain a sense of control and understanding in an unpredictable world. If we can convince ourselves that we knew it all along, then the world seems more orderly and predictable than it really is. But this false sense of predictability is dangerous. It makes us overconfident in our forecasting abilities, leading us to take risks we shouldn't take. It makes us judge past decision makers too harshly, criticizing them for not seeing what was obvious when it wasn't obvious at all. And it prevents us from learning from history, because if we think we already understood why something happened, we don't dig deeper to find the real causes. Hindsight bias turns us all into Monday morning quarterbacks, brilliant in retrospect, blind to our own blindness. A financial advisor meets with a client in late 21. The stock market has been soaring for years. The client wants to invest heavily in tech stocks. They've been performing so well lately. The advisor, caught up in the same enthusiasm, agrees. 6 months later, the market crashes, and the client's portfolio is devastated. This is recency bias, the tendency to weigh recent events more heavily than earlier events. What happened yesterday feels more relevant than what happened last year, even when the older information is more predictive. Investors pile into assets that have recently performed well, assuming the trend will continue, then panic and sell when those same assets decline, locking in their losses. Sports fans judge players based on their last few games rather than their career statistics. Employers evaluate workers based on their most recent performance rather than their overall track record. Our brains evolved to prioritize recent information because in a changing environment, the most recent data is often the most relevant. If the watering hole was safe yesterday, it's probably safe today. If it was dangerous yesterday, that's more important than the fact that it was safe last month. But financial markets, career trajectories, and complex systems don't work like watering holes. They're cyclical, mean-reverting, and influenced by countless variables that play out over long time horizons. Recency bias makes us chase performance, buying high and selling low. It makes us overreact to short-term fluctuations while ignoring long-term trends. It turns us into goldfish, with memories that extend back only a few moments, making the same mistakes our predecessors made because we can't remember or can't properly weight the lessons of the past. The recent feels urgent, important, predictive. Usually, it's just recent. A couple sits in a movie theater, 45 minutes into a terrible film. They're both miserable, but neither suggests leaving. "We paid $30 for these tickets," one whispers. So they sit through another hour of cinematic torture, sacrificing 2 hours of their finite lives to justify a $30 expense they can never recover. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because we've already invested in it, even when continuing is clearly irrational. The money is gone, the time is spent. These are sunk costs. They cannot be recovered regardless of what you do next. The only rational question is, what will give me the best outcome from this point forward? But humans don't think this way. We stay in bad relationships because we've already invested years. We continue failing business ventures because we've already invested money. We finish books we hate because we've already read 200 pages. We pursue careers we've grown to despise because we've already spent years training for them. In one study, researchers told participants they'd accidentally booked 2 ski trips for the same weekend, one to Michigan for $50 and one to Wisconsin for $100. They described the Wisconsin trip as likely to be less fun. Then they asked, which trip would you go on? Most people chose Wisconsin, the more expensive but less enjoyable option, because they couldn't bear to waste the larger investment. The sunk cost fallacy exists because loss aversion, our tendency to feel losses more acutely than equivalent gains, makes already spent resources feel like they're still at stake. Abandoning a project feels like admitting the investment was wasted, triggering psychological pain. So we throw good money after bad, good time after wasted time, compounding our losses in a futile attempt to retroactively justify past decisions. We become prisoners of our past investments, unable to cut our losses and move forward, forever trying to make the unrecoverable recovered. A man at a dinner party holds forth confidently on climate science despite having no training in the field. He's read a few articles, watched some YouTube videos, and now he's certain he understands the issue better than the scientists who've spent decades studying it. Meanwhile, an actual climate scientist at the same party speaks hesitantly, qualifying her statements, acknowledging uncertainty. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect, the narrator explains. The tendency for people with low ability in a domain to overestimate their competence while experts underestimate theirs. In the original study, people who scored in the bottom quartile on tests of logic, grammar, and humor rated their abilities as above average. They weren't just incompetent, they were too incompetent to recognize their own incompetence. The skills needed to be good at something are often the same skills needed to recognize what being good at something looks like. If you don't know much about a subject, you don't know enough to realize how much you don't know. The landscape of your ignorance is invisible to you. You see the small hill you've climbed and think you're at the summit, unaware of the mountains beyond. Experts, conversely, are acutely aware of the vastness of their field, the complexity of the questions, the limitations of current knowledge. Their expertise makes them humble. This effect explains why internet comment sections are filled with confident proclamations from people who've done 20 minutes of Google research, while actual experts are drowned out or dismissed as biased. It explains why incompetent leaders often rise to power. Their confidence is mistaken for competence. It explains why the phrase, "I don't know," is so rare in public discourse, even though it's often the most accurate answer. The Dunning-Kruger effect creates a world where ignorance speaks loudly and knowledge whispers, where confidence is inversely proportional to understanding, and where the people least qualified to make decisions are often the most certain they should be making them. A woman is shocked when her preferred political candidate loses the election. "I don't understand," she says. "Everyone I know voted for her. How could this happen?" Her social circle reveals itself. People who share her education level, her income bracket, her neighborhood, her values. She's surrounded herself with people who think like her, and now she's genuinely surprised that the broader population doesn't share her views. This is the false consensus effect, the narrator explains. The tendency to overestimate how much other people share our beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. We assume our own opinions are common and appropriate, that others think the way we think, value what we value, and see what we see. In one classic study, researchers asked college students if they'd be willing to walk around campus wearing a sandwich board that said "Eat at Joe's." Those who agreed estimated that 62% of other students would also agree. Those who refused estimated that only 33% would agree. Each group assumed their own response was typical. The false consensus effect exists because we use ourselves as a reference point for understanding others. Our own thoughts and feelings are the most accessible data we have about how humans think and feel. We also tend to associate with people similar to us, creating echo chambers that reinforce our sense that our views are normal. And we're motivated to believe our opinions are correct, which is easier if we think most people share them. But this bias makes us terrible at understanding people different from us. It makes us shocked by election results, baffled by others' choices, and convinced that people who disagree with us must be stupid or malicious rather than simply different. It makes us poor negotiators because we assume others want what we want. It makes us ineffective communicators because we assume others understand what we mean without explanation. And it makes us increasingly polarized because we can't fathom how reasonable people could possibly disagree with us. So we conclude that those who disagree must be unreasonable. A driver cuts you off in traffic. What an asshole, you think. You've just made the fundamental attribution error, attributing their behavior to their character. They're a bad person rather than their situation. Maybe they're rushing to the hospital, or didn't see you, or are a new driver who made a mistake. Later that day, you cut someone off, but you don't think you're an asshole. You had a good reason. You were distracted, or in a hurry, or the sun was in your eyes. This is the fundamental attribution error, the narrator says. The tendency to attribute others' behaviors to their personality or character while attributing our own behaviors to situational factors. When others fail, we think they're incompetent. When we fail, we had bad luck or faced difficult circumstances. When others succeed, they got lucky or had advantages. When we succeed, it's because of our hard work and talent. In one study, participants read essays either supporting or opposing Fidel Castro. They were told the essay writers had been assigned their positions. They had no choice in what stance to take. Yet participants still rated the essay writers as genuinely holding the opinions they'd been forced to argue. Even when we know someone's behavior was situationally determined, we still attribute it to their character. This bias exists because when we observe others, their behavior is salient and their situation is invisible. We see the person cutting us off. We don't see the emergency they're rushing to. When we observe ourselves, our situation is salient and our behavior feels like a natural response to circumstances. The fundamental attribution error makes us judgmental and unforgiving of others while being understanding and forgiving of ourselves. It damages relationships because we interpret our partner's mistakes as character flaws while viewing our own as understandable responses to stress. It makes us poor judges of others' abilities because we don't account for the situations they're operating in. And it makes us blind to systemic problems because we attribute outcomes to individual character rather than structural circumstances. We live in a world of good people and bad people, when really we live in a world of people responding to situations, some of which bring out the best in us and some of which bring out the worst. A woman learns that her friend has been diagnosed with cancer. Her first thought, which she's ashamed to admit even to herself, what did she do wrong? Did she smoke? Eat poorly? Not exercise enough? She's searching for a reason, a cause, something her friend did to deserve this. Because if cancer is random, if it can strike anyone regardless of their choices, then she's vulnerable too. This is the just world hypothesis, the narrator explains. The tendency to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. If someone is suffering, they must have done something to cause it. If someone is successful, they must have earned it. In one disturbing study, participants watched a woman receive electric shocks. When they were told they couldn't stop the shocks, They began to denigrate the woman, rating her as less attractive and less likable. They couldn't help her, so they convinced themselves she deserved her suffering. The just world hypothesis serves a psychological function. It makes the world feel predictable and controllable. If good behavior leads to good outcomes, then we can protect ourselves by being good. If bad outcomes are deserved, then we can avoid them by avoiding bad behavior. But this belief is demonstrably false. Children get cancer. Natural disasters kill indiscriminately. Hard-working people lose their jobs through no fault of their own. And yet we cling to the just world hypothesis because the alternative, that the world is fundamentally random and unfair, is terrifying. This bias makes us blame victims. We ask what the assault victim was wearing, what the poor person did to end up homeless, what the sick person did to get sick. We convince ourselves that bad things happen for reasons, that suffering is deserved, because acknowledging that suffering is often random would force us to confront our own vulnerability. The just world hypothesis lets us sleep at night, but it does so by making us cruel, judgmental, and blind to injustice. We mistake fortune for virtue and misfortune for vice, creating a world where the lucky congratulate themselves on their moral superiority, while the unlucky are blamed for circumstances beyond their control. A teacher receives feedback from 30 students. 29 evaluations are glowing. One is harshly critical. That night, she can't sleep. She replays the negative comment over and over, while the 29 positive ones fade into background noise. This is negativity bias, the narrator says. The tendency for negative events, emotions, and information to affect us more strongly than positive ones. Bad is stronger than good. A criticism hurts more than a compliment feels good. A loss feels worse than an equivalent gain feels good. A bad reputation is easy to acquire and hard to lose, while a good reputation is hard to acquire and easy to lose. In one study, researchers showed people photos of faces with positive, negative, and neutral expressions while measuring their brain activity. Negative faces produced much stronger electrical activity in the brain than positive or neutral ones. Our brains are wired to pay more attention to threats than opportunities, to dangers than delights. This makes evolutionary sense. Our ancestors who were more attuned to negative information, that's a predator, that plant is poisonous, that person is hostile, were more likely to survive than those who were more attuned to positive information. The cost of missing a positive opportunity, a potential meal, was smaller than the cost of missing a negative threat, becoming a meal. But in our modern world, where physical threats are rare, negativity bias makes us miserable. We ruminate on criticism while dismissing praise. We remember insults for years while forgetting compliments by the next day. We focus on what's wrong in our lives while taking what's right for granted. Negativity bias also shapes our information environment. News outlets know that if it bleeds, it leads. Negative stories attract more attention than positive ones. This creates a distorted view of reality where the world seems more dangerous, more corrupt, and more broken than it actually is. We become pessimists not because the world is getting worse, but because our brains are designed to weight negative information more heavily than positive. We live in the safest, healthiest, most prosperous time in human history. Yet we're convinced everything is falling apart, because the bad captures our attention while the good fades into the background. A young man lights a cigarette. He knows smoking causes cancer. The warning is right there on the package, but he doesn't really believe it will happen to him. Cancer happens to other people. He's different. He's lucky. He'll quit before it becomes a problem. This is optimism bias, the narrator explains. The tendency to believe that we're less likely than others to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive ones. We think we're less likely to get divorced, even though we know the divorce rate. We think we're less likely to get in car accidents, even though we know the statistics. We think our projects will be completed on time and under budget, even though most projects run late and over budget. In one study, researchers asked engaged couples to estimate the likelihood that they would get divorced. On average, they estimated their chances at 0%, even though they knew that 40 to 50% of marriages end in divorce. They weren't ignorant of the statistics, they just didn't think the statistics applied to them. Optimism bias exists because it feels good and motivates action. If we fully appreciated all the risks we face, we might never get out of bed. Optimism helps us take chances, start businesses, pursue relationships, and try new things. But it also makes us reckless. We don't save enough for retirement because we assume we'll be healthy and employed. We don't wear seatbelts because we assume we won't crash. We don't prepare for disasters because we assume they won't strike us. Optimism bias is why people buy lottery tickets, overestimating their chances of winning, but don't buy insurance, underestimating their chances of needing it. It's why entrepreneurs start businesses despite knowing that most businesses fail. They're convinced they'll be the exception. And it's why we're often blindsided by negative events we should have seen coming. We're not stupid or ignorant. We're just convinced that we're special, that the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to us, that we're the protagonists in a story where things work out in the end. Sometimes this optimism is adaptive, pushing us to achieve things we wouldn't attempt if we were realistic about our chances. But often it's just a setup for disappointment, a cognitive bias that makes us unprepared for a world that doesn't care about our expectations. A woman has been with the same cell phone carrier for 15 years. She's not particularly happy with the service, and she knows there are cheaper options with better coverage. But switching seems like such a hassle. She'd have to research other carriers, transfer her number, set up a new account. So she stays, paying more for worse service year after year. This is status quo bias, the narrator says. The tendency to prefer things to stay the same, to stick with current circumstances even when change would be beneficial. We keep the default settings on our devices. We stay in jobs we've outgrown. We maintain investments we should sell. We stick with the first option presented to us, even when better options are available. In one famous study, researchers looked at organ donation rates across countries. In some countries, you have to opt in to be an organ donor. In others, you're automatically a donor unless you opt out. The rates were dramatically different. In opt-in countries, only 4 to 28% of people were donors, while in opt-out countries, 86 to 100% were donors. The only difference was which option was the default. Status quo bias exists because change requires effort and creates uncertainty. The current situation is known, alternatives are unknown. Even if the current situation is suboptimal, at least we understand it. We've adapted to it. Change might make things better, but it might make things worse. And loss aversion makes us fear the potential downside more than we value the potential upside. Status quo bias also serves an ego-protective function. If we change, we're implicitly admitting that our previous choice was wrong. Staying the course lets us avoid that admission. But this bias makes us prisoners of our past decisions. We stick with failing strategies because they're familiar. We resist innovation because it threatens the comfortable present. We let inertia make our decisions for us, defaulting into lives we never actively chose. Status quo bias is why revolutions are rare and incremental change is common, why bad systems persist long after everyone agrees they're bad, and why the phrase "we've always done it this way" is the most dangerous sentence in any language. The status quo feels safe, neutral, like not making a choice at all, but maintaining the status quo is a choice, and often it's the wrong one. A teenager sees that a new social media app is trending. All her friends are downloading it. She doesn't particularly want it, she's already overwhelmed by the apps she has. But she downloads it anyway. If everyone else is using it, it must be good. And if she doesn't use it, she'll be left out. This is the bandwagon effect, the narrator explains. The tendency to do or believe things because many other people do or believe them. The more people who adopt a belief or behavior, the more likely others are to adopt it, regardless of the underlying evidence. We buy books that are bestsellers, eat at restaurants with long lines, and vote for candidates who are leading in the polls. In one study, researchers created fake music download websites where participants could listen to and download songs. In one version, participants could see how many times each song had been downloaded. In another version, they couldn't. When download counts were visible, popular songs became more popular and unpopular songs became less popular. The rich got richer. But here's the twist. The researchers randomly manipulated which songs appeared popular at the start. Songs that were artificially shown as popular became genuinely popular, even though they'd been randomly selected. Popularity created popularity, independent of quality. The bandwagon effect exists because other people's choices provide information. If everyone is doing something, maybe they know something we don't. Following the crowd is often a safe bet. There's wisdom in crowds, and going against consensus is risky. The bandwagon effect also fulfills our need to belong, to be part of the group, to not be left behind. But this bias creates information cascades where everyone is following everyone else, and no one is actually evaluating the underlying merits. It creates bubbles in markets, in fashion, in ideas, where things become popular simply because they're popular, until the bubble bursts and everyone wonders what they were thinking. It makes us conformists, suppressing our own judgment in favor of the crowds, even when the crowd is wrong. The bandwagon effect is why bad ideas can spread like wildfire, why mediocre products can dominate markets, and why everyone's doing it is simultaneously the worst and most persuasive argument ever made. A doctor presents a patient with two treatment options for a disease. Treatment A has a 90% survival rate, she says. The patient feels hopeful and chooses treatment A. Another doctor presents the same treatment to another patient differently. Treatment A has a 10% mortality rate. This patient feels anxious and chooses a different treatment. The statistics are identical, only the framing has changed. This is the framing effect, the narrator says. The tendency for people's decisions to be influenced by how information is presented rather than just by the information itself. The same facts framed differently lead to different conclusions. In a famous study, researchers asked participants to choose between two programs to combat a disease expected to kill 600 people. Program A would save 200 people for certain. Program B had a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 people and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. When framed in terms of lives saved, 72% chose Program A, the certain option. Then researchers presented the same programs to different participants, but framed in terms of deaths. Program A would result in 400 people dying for certain. Program B had a 1/3 chance that no one would die and a 2/3 chance that all 600 would die. Now only 22% chose Program A. The programs were mathematically identical, but the framing completely reversed people's preferences. The framing effect exists because our brains process information contextually. We don't evaluate facts in isolation. We evaluate them relative to how they're presented. Gains and losses feel different, even when they're equivalent. Percentages and absolute numbers create different impressions, even when they convey the same information. The framing effect is why politicians carefully craft their language. Tax relief sounds better than tax cuts. Climate change sounds less alarming than climate crisis. And enhanced interrogation sounds more palatable than torture. It's why marketers say 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat, why they emphasize what you gain rather than what you lose. The framing effect means that whoever controls the language controls the decision, that the same reality can be made to seem positive or negative, risky or safe, desirable or repellent, simply by choosing which aspects to emphasize and which words to use. We think we're responding to facts, but we're often just responding to frames. A student receives an A on an exam. I studied really hard, she thinks. I'm smart and I earned this grade. The same student receives an F on another exam. The test was unfair, she thinks. The teacher doesn't like me. The material wasn't covered properly in class. Different outcomes, different explanations, but a consistent pattern. Success is attributed to internal factors, her ability and effort, while failure is attributed to external factors, unfair circumstances. This is self-serving bias, the narrator explains. The tendency to attribute positive outcomes to our own character or actions while attributing negative outcomes to external factors beyond our control. We take credit for success and deflect blame for failure. When our team wins, it's because we played well. When we lose, it's because the refs were biased or we had bad luck. When our investments perform well, it's because we're savvy investors. When they perform poorly, it's because the market was irrational. In one study, researchers asked married couples to estimate what percentage of household chores they each did. The percentages added up to more than 100%. Each person overestimated their own contribution and underestimated their partner's. Self-serving bias exists to protect our self-esteem. Believing we're responsible for good outcomes makes us feel competent and in control. Believing we're not responsible for bad outcomes protects us from feeling incompetent or guilty. This bias is so strong that even when people are told they succeeded or failed randomly, they still exhibit self-serving attributions. But this bias damages relationships. When both partners take credit for successes and blame the other for failures, resentment builds. It prevents learning. If we never take responsibility for our failures, we never learn from them. It makes us overconfident. If we attribute all our successes to skill and all our failures to luck, we'll overestimate our abilities. And it creates a distorted view of reality, where we're the heroes of our own stories, blameless victims of circumstance when things go wrong, brilliant strategists when things go right, never quite seeing ourselves as we actually are, flawed humans whose outcomes are determined by a complex mix of skill, effort, and circumstances, some within our control and many beyond it. A job interviewer meets two candidates. The first is attractive, well-dressed, and has a firm handshake. The second is average-looking, dressed casually, and seems nervous. Before either has answered a single question, the interviewer has already formed an impression. The attractive candidate seems more competent, more trustworthy, more hireable. This is the halo effect, the narrator says. The tendency for our impression of someone in one domain to influence our impression of them in other domains. If someone is attractive, we assume they're also intelligent, kind, and competent. If someone is good at one thing, we assume they're good at other things. If we like one aspect of something, we tend to like other aspects too. In one study, researchers showed participants photos of attractive and unattractive people accused of crimes. Participants recommended lighter sentences for attractive defendants, rating them as less dangerous and more likely to be rehabilitated. Physical attractiveness, which has nothing to do with criminal behavior, influenced judgments about guilt and punishment. The halo effect exists because our brains like consistency. If someone is good in one way, it feels cognitively coherent for them to be good in other ways. Evaluating each trait independently requires more mental effort than letting one trait color our perception of all the others. But the halo effect makes us terrible judges of character and ability. We hire attractive people over more qualified candidates. We trust charismatic leaders even when they're incompetent. We assume that because someone is an expert in one field, their opinions in other fields are also valuable. The physicist who pontificates on politics, the actor who promotes pseudoscience, the business mogul who thinks their success in one industry qualifies them to run a country. The halo effect works in reverse too. The Horn effect, where one negative trait makes us assume everything else is negative. One mistake, one flaw, one bad first impression, and suddenly everything about the person seems suspect. We don't see people as they are complex beings with strengths and weaknesses, good at some things and bad at others. We see them through the distorting lens of our first impression, letting one salient characteristic cast its glow or shadow over everything else. A writer sits down to work on a book. "I'll finish this in 6 months," he tells his publisher confidently. He's written books before. They always take longer than he expects. The last one took 2 years, and the one before that took 18 months. But this time will be different. This time he knows what he's doing. This time he won't get stuck. 18 months later, he's still writing. This is the planning fallacy, the narrator explains. The tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take, even when we have extensive experience with similar tasks taking longer than expected. We think our projects will be completed quickly and smoothly. We think we'll finish our work ahead of schedule. We think we'll stick to our budgets. We're almost always wrong. In one study, researchers asked students to estimate how long it would take them to complete their senior theses. On average, students estimated 33.9 days. The actual average was 55.5 days, 64% longer than predicted. Even when asked for a worst-case scenario, students' estimates were still too optimistic. The planning fallacy exists because when we plan, we imagine everything going right. We think about the task itself, not all the things that might go wrong or take longer than expected. We focus on the best-case scenario and ignore the base rate, how long similar tasks have actually taken in the past. We also suffer from an optimism bias that makes us think we're different, that the problems that plagued past projects won't affect this one. The planning fallacy is why construction projects run over budget and behind schedule, why software launches are delayed, why home renovations take twice as long as contractors promise. It's why you're always running late, why your to-do list never gets finished, why you're reading this documentary script that was supposed to be 8,000 words but is now approaching 10,000. We're not learning from experience, we're ignoring it, convinced that this time somehow will be different. The planning fallacy makes us perpetually surprised by outcomes we should have expected, forever optimistic about timelines we'll never meet, always believing that the future will be easier than the past, even though the past keeps proving us wrong. A software engineer tries to explain a technical problem to a non-technical colleague. She uses jargon, skips over basic concepts, and grows frustrated when the colleague doesn't understand. It's so simple, she thinks. But it's not simple. It's only simple to her because she spent years learning this material. She can't remember what it was like not to know it. This is the curse of knowledge, the narrator says. The tendency for people who know something to be unable to imagine what it's like not to know it. Once you understand something, you can't ununderstand it. You can't recreate the mental state of ignorance you once had. In one famous study, researchers had participants tap out the rhythm of well-known songs on a table and asked listeners to identify the songs. The tappers predicted that listeners would identify the songs 50% of the time. The actual success rate was 2.5%. The tappers could hear the melody in their heads as they tapped, so they couldn't imagine that the listeners were just hearing random taps. The curse of knowledge exists because knowledge changes how we perceive the world. Once you know that the duck-rabbit drawing can be seen as either a duck or a rabbit, you can't unsee both interpretations. Once you know the answer to a riddle, you can't recreate the experience of not knowing. Our current knowledge feels obvious, natural, and easy, so we assume it should be obvious, natural, and easy for others. But the curse of knowledge makes us terrible teachers and communicators. We skip steps that seem obvious to us but aren't obvious to learners. We use jargon without defining it. We grow impatient with questions that seem basic. We design products that make sense to us but confuse users. We write instructions that are clear to us but incomprehensible to others. The curse of knowledge creates a communication gap between experts and novices, between those who know and those who need to learn, making it harder to transfer knowledge precisely when transfer is most needed. We forget that we once didn't know what we now know, that the path from ignorance to understanding was longer and harder than it now seems, that what feels simple to us now once felt impossibly complex. A man spends 3 hours assembling a bookshelf from IKEA. It's slightly crooked, one shelf is a bit wobbly, and there's a mysterious extra screw left over. But when he looks at it, he feels a surge of pride. He thinks it's beautiful. He values it more than a professionally made bookshelf that's objectively superior. This is the IKEA effect, the narrator explains, the tendency to value things more highly when we've put effort into creating them. We overvalue our own creations, our own ideas, our own work. In one study, researchers had participants build simple origami figures or assemble IKEA boxes. Then they asked participants how much they'd pay for their own creations versus identical items made by others. Participants valued their own creations much more highly, even though they were objectively no better and often worse than the professionally made versions. The IKEA effect exists because effort creates attachment. When we invest time and energy into something, we become psychologically invested in its value. Valuing our own work also protects our self-esteem. If we admitted that our creations were mediocre, we'd have to admit that our effort was wasted. The IKEA effect has positive aspects. It makes us appreciate our own work, motivates us to complete projects, and creates emotional connections to things we've made. But it also makes us overvalue our own ideas and resist feedback. We think our first draft is better than it is. We think our business plan is more solid than it is. We think our children are more talented than they are. The IKEA effect makes us poor judges of our own work, unable to see its flaws because we're blinded by the effort we invested. It makes us defensive when others criticize our creations, because criticizing our work feels like criticizing us, and it makes us reluctant to abandon failing projects because we've invested so much effort that we can't bear to admit it was wasted. We confuse effort with value, sweat with quality, our investment with the thing's worth, loving our crooked bookshelves precisely because they're crooked, because we made them, because they're ours. A new song comes on the radio. You don't particularly like it. It's catchy but annoying. The next day, you hear it again. Still annoying, but by the 10th time you've heard it, you find yourself humming along. By the 20th, you actually like it. Nothing about the song has changed, only your exposure to it has increased. This is the mere exposure effect, the narrator says. The tendency to develop a preference for things simply because we're familiar with them. The more we're exposed to something, the more we like it, even if we weren't initially positive about it. In one study, researchers showed participants Chinese characters and told them they were adjectives. Some characters were shown once, others 5 times, others 10 times, others 25 times. Then participants were asked to guess whether each character meant something good or something bad. Characters that had been shown more frequently were more likely to be guessed as meaning something positive. Mere exposure with no additional information created positive associations. The mere exposure effect exists because familiarity signals safety. In our ancestral environment, things we'd encountered before and survived were safer than novel things. Repeated exposure without negative consequences taught our brains that something was safe, and safe things became preferred things. But the mere exposure effect makes us susceptible to manipulation. Advertisers know that simply getting their brand in front of you repeatedly, even if you're not paying attention, will make you more likely to choose it later. Politicians know that name recognition matters more than policy positions. Propagandists know that repeating a lie often enough will make people believe it, or at least find it more plausible. The mere exposure effect is why you like the town you grew up in, even if it's objectively not that great. It's why you prefer your own face in the mirror, which you see every day, to your face in photos, which is reversed and less familiar. It's why arranged marriages often work. Couples grow to love each other through repeated exposure. And it's why echo chambers are so powerful. The more we're exposed to certain ideas, the more we like them, regardless of their merit. Familiarity doesn't breed contempt, it breeds comfort, preference, and eventually affection. We like what we know, not because it's good, but because we know it. A teenager walks into school with a small stain on his shirt. He's mortified. He's convinced everyone is staring at him, judging him, noticing his imperfection. He spends the whole day trying to hide the stain, certain that his social reputation is ruined. In reality, almost no one notices. Those who do notice forget about it immediately, but he can't shake the feeling that he's the center of attention. This is the spotlight effect, the narrator explains. The tendency to overestimate how much others notice and care about our appearance and behavior. We feel like we're on stage with a spotlight shining on us, and everyone in the audience is watching our every move. In reality, everyone else is on their own stage, under their own spotlight, worried about their own performance. In one study, researchers had participants wear embarrassing t-shirts featuring Barry Manilow and then estimate how many people in a room noticed the shirt. Participants estimated that about 50% of people noticed. The actual number was about 25%. We think we're more noticeable than we are. The spotlight effect exists because we're the center of our own experience. Our appearance, our behavior, our mistakes. These are salient to us, occupying our attention and our thoughts. We naturally assume they're equally salient to others. But others are focused on themselves, not on us. The spotlight effect makes us self-conscious and anxious. We're afraid to speak up in meetings because we think everyone will judge us. We're afraid to try new things because we think everyone will notice if we fail. We agonize over minor social mistakes, convinced they've ruined our reputation, when in reality, no one else remembers them. The spotlight effect is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because we're not as important to others as we think we are. Liberating because this means we're free to take risks, make mistakes, and be ourselves without the constant fear of judgment. Most people aren't watching you. They're too busy worrying about who's watching them. The spotlight we feel is mostly in our own heads, a phantom audience that exists more in our imagination than in reality. An older man shakes his head at the news. "The world is going to hell," he mutters. "Things were so much better when I was young. People were more respectful. Communities were stronger. Life was simpler." He genuinely believes this, but the statistics tell a different story. Violent crime is down, poverty is down, literacy is up, life expectancy is up, child mortality is down. By almost every objective measure, the world is better than it was when he was young. But he can't shake the feeling that everything is declining. This is declinism, the narrator says. The tendency to believe that things are worse than they used to be, that society is in decline, that the past was better than the present. Every generation believes the next generation is worse, lazier, more entitled, less respectful. Every era believes it's living through uniquely terrible times. In ancient Rome, people complained that the youth were disrespectful and society was declining. In medieval times, people believed they were living in a fallen age compared to the glories of Rome. In the Victorian era, people worried that modern life was making people weak and immoral. The complaints are always the same, only the specifics change. Declinism exists for several reasons. First, we remember the past selectively, recalling the good times and forgetting the bad. Second, we were younger in the past, and youth itself makes experiences seem more vivid and meaningful. Third, negativity bias makes us pay more attention to current problems than current progress. Fourth, the world is always changing, and change feels like loss to those who are adapted to the old way. But declinism makes us pessimistic, nostalgic, and resistant to progress. We oppose changes that would make things better because we're convinced things were better before. We fail to appreciate the genuine improvements in human welfare because we're focused on what's been lost. We scare ourselves with narratives of decline that aren't supported by evidence. Declinism is why every generation thinks the next generation is doomed, why people always believe they're living in uniquely terrible times, why back in my day is the preface to so many false claims. The past wasn't better. It's just that memory has airbrushed out the problems and highlighted the pleasures, leaving us with a distorted image of a golden age that never actually existed. A basketball player makes 3 shots in a row. He's got the hot hand, the announcer shouts. The player's teammates start feeding him the ball, convinced he's in a zone where he can't miss. But statistical analysis shows that the hot hand is largely an illusion. Players who've made several shots in a row are no more likely to make the next shot than they would be otherwise. The pattern we see is just randomness that looks meaningful. This is the clustering illusion, the narrator explains. The tendency to see patterns in random data. We see faces in clouds, messages in coincidences, and meaning in noise. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, constantly searching for order in chaos. This was adaptive in our evolutionary past. The ability to recognize patterns, that's a predator's footprint, those berries are poisonous, this weather pattern means rain, was crucial for survival. But our pattern recognition systems are oversensitive, erring on the side of seeing patterns even when they're not there. In one study, researchers showed participants random sequences of coin flips. Participants consistently identified patterns and streaks in the sequences, even though they were completely random. We see winning streaks and losing streaks in gambling, even though each event is independent. We see cancer clusters in neighborhoods, even though the distribution is consistent with random chance. We see conspiracies and coincidences, even though coincidences are mathematically inevitable in a world with billions of people and trillions of events. The clustering illusion makes us superstitious. We develop lucky rituals based on random correlations. We see omens and signs in meaningless events. We believe in the hot hand, the gambler's fallacy, and the idea that bad things come in threes. The clustering illusion also makes us vulnerable to pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. We see patterns in data that support our beliefs while dismissing the randomness that contradicts them. We're meaning-making machines in a universe that's often meaningless, forever finding faces in the clouds, convinced that the random is really a pattern, that the noise is really a signal, that the chaos is really a code waiting to be cracked. A woman is having dinner with friends. Someone asks a trivia question. Who was the first person to walk on the moon? Before anyone can answer, someone pulls out their phone. Neil Armstrong, they read from Google. The conversation moves on. No one has actually remembered the answer. They've just looked it up. Later, if asked the same question, they probably won't remember. They'll just Google it again. This is the Google effect, also called digital amnesia, the narrator says. The tendency to forget information that we know we can easily look up online. Why remember something when we can just Google it? Why memorize facts when we have the entire sum of human knowledge in our pockets? In one study, researchers had participants type trivia facts into a computer. Half were told the information would be saved, half were told it would be erased. Those who thought the information would be saved remembered significantly less than those who thought it would be erased. We don't bother to remember what we think we can access later. The Google effect is a form of transactive memory. We've always outsourced memory to external sources like books, notes, and other people. But the internet has dramatically accelerated this process. We're outsourcing more and more of our memory to devices, remembering not the information itself, but where to find it. This has benefits. We can access far more information than we could ever memorize, freeing up cognitive resources for higher-level thinking. But it also has costs. We're losing the deep, internalized knowledge that comes from memorization. We're becoming dependent on our devices, helpless when they're not available. We're losing the connections between pieces of information that come from holding them all in our minds simultaneously. And we're losing the confidence that comes from knowing things, replacing it with the anxiety of needing to constantly look things up. The Google effect is changing not just what we know, but how we know, transforming us from repositories of knowledge into navigators of information, forever one search away from knowing anything but never quite knowing anything for certain. A man buys a new car. It's expensive, and he had to stretch his budget to afford it. A few weeks later, he starts noticing problems. The fuel efficiency isn't as good as advertised, the ride is rougher than he expected, and some of the features are clunky. But when friends ask him about the car, he raves about it. He focuses on the positives and downplays the negatives. He's convinced himself that he made the right choice. This is choice supportive bias, the narrator explains. The tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an option we've chosen and negative attributes to options we've rejected. Once we make a choice, we convince ourselves it was the right choice, even if evidence suggests otherwise. We remember the chosen option as better than it was and the rejected options as worse than they were. In one study, researchers had participants choose between two vacation destinations. After making their choice, participants rated their chosen destination more positively and the rejected destination more negatively than they had before making the choice. The act of choosing changed their perceptions. Choice supportive bias exists to reduce cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs. If we've chosen something but it turns out to be flawed, we experience dissonance. We can either admit we made a mistake, which is psychologically painful, or convince ourselves that we made the right choice, which is psychologically comfortable. Most of us choose comfort. Choice supportive bias helps us feel satisfied with our decisions and move forward without regret. But it also prevents us from learning from mistakes. If we always convince ourselves our choices were right, we never examine why they might have been wrong. It makes us defensive when others question our decisions. It makes us double down on failing courses of action, and it makes us poor advisors to others, because we can't objectively evaluate our own past choices. We become prisoners of our past decisions, forever justifying them, forever convinced that the path we chose was the right path, even when all the evidence suggests we should have turned back miles ago. A woman goes grocery shopping while hungry. She buys far too much food, including many snacks she doesn't usually eat. She's convinced she'll want all this food later. But when she gets home, full from the meal she ate after shopping, she looks at her purchases with regret. Why did she buy so much? She won't eat half of this. This is projection bias, the narrator says. The tendency to assume that our future preferences will be the same as our current preferences. When we're hungry, we think we'll always be hungry. When we're happy, we can't imagine being sad. When we're in love, we can't imagine falling out of love. We project our current state onto our future selves, failing to account for how much our preferences and feelings will change. In one study, researchers asked people ordering food for next week to choose between healthy and unhealthy options. Those who were hungry when ordering chose more unhealthy options, assuming they'd want them next week. Those who were full chose healthier options. Both groups were wrong. They were projecting their current hunger state onto their future selves. Projection bias exists because our current state is vivid and salient, while our future state is abstract and hard to imagine. We can't fully simulate what it will be like to be our future selves, so we assume our future selves will be like our current selves. But projection bias leads to poor decisions. We buy gym memberships when we're motivated, not accounting for how unmotivated we'll be in the future. We commit to social plans when we're feeling extroverted, not accounting for how much we'll want to stay home when the time comes. We make promises when we're feeling generous, not accounting for how selfish we'll feel later. We save too little for retirement because we can't imagine being old. We fail to prepare for emotional states we're not currently in. Projection bias makes us strangers to our future selves, unable to predict what they'll want or need, forever surprised when the future arrives and we discover that we're different people than we thought we'd be. Two drunk drivers get behind the wheel. Driver A makes it home safely. Driver B hits and kills a pedestrian. Both made the same choice, took the same risk, exhibited the same moral failing, but we judge them very differently. Driver A might lose their license. Driver B goes to prison for manslaughter. The only difference is luck, whether a pedestrian happened to be in the road at that moment. This is moral luck, the narrator explains, the tendency to judge people's moral character based on outcomes rather than intentions or actions. We judge people more harshly when their actions lead to bad outcomes, even if the outcomes were beyond their control. We judge people more favorably when their actions lead to good outcomes, even if the good outcomes were just luck. In one study, researchers presented participants with scenarios where someone's action led to either a good or bad outcome by chance. Participants judged the person's character differently based on the outcome, even though the action was identical. Moral luck exists because outcomes are salient and concrete, while intentions and probabilities are abstract. We see the dead pedestrian. We don't see the parallel universe where driver A also hit someone. We judge based on what happened, not what could have happened. But moral luck makes our moral judgments inconsistent and unfair. We punish people for bad luck and reward them for good luck, rather than judging them based on their choices and character. We treat attempted murder less seriously than successful murder, even though the moral failing is the same. We celebrate entrepreneurs who succeeded through luck, while condemning those who failed through equally bad luck, even though both took similar risks. Moral luck means that our moral judgments are partly determined by factors beyond anyone's control: the randomness of the universe, the chaos of circumstance, the roll of the dice. We want to believe that people get what they deserve, that outcomes reflect character. But often, outcomes just reflect luck, and our moral judgments reflect our inability to separate the two. A person who's never experienced depression tries to understand a friend who's depressed. Just think positive thoughts, they suggest. Go for a walk, you'll feel better. They genuinely can't understand why their friend doesn't just snap out of it. They've never felt that kind of despair, so they can't imagine what it's like. This is the empathy gap, the narrator says. The tendency to underestimate how much our own mental states differ from others, and how much our own mental states will differ in the future. When we're in one emotional state, we can't fully understand or predict what it's like to be in a different emotional state. When we're calm, we can't imagine how we'll act when we're angry. When we're sober, we can't imagine the decisions we'll make when we're drunk. When we're comfortable, we can't imagine the desperation of someone in pain. In one study, researchers asked participants to plunge their hands into ice water, a painful experience. Before doing it, participants predicted they'd be willing to repeat the experience for a small payment. After doing it, they demanded much more money to repeat it. They couldn't accurately predict how much the pain would affect them. The empathy gap exists because we can't fully simulate emotional states we're not currently experiencing. Our current state dominates our awareness, making other states seem distant and abstract. But the empathy gap makes us judgmental and unsympathetic. We blame people for decisions they made in emotional states we've never experienced. We can't understand why people stay in abusive relationships, why addicts can't just quit, why people make self-destructive choices. We lack empathy, not because we're cruel, but because we literally can't imagine what it's like to be them. The empathy gap also makes us poor planners for our own future. We make commitments when we're motivated that we can't keep when we're unmotivated. We underestimate how much we'll be affected by future emotions. We're strangers not just to others' experiences, but to our own future experiences, forever trapped in the present moment, unable to fully imagine any other state of being. We return to the busy city intersection from the opening. The same people cross the street, make the same decisions, hold the same beliefs, but now we see them differently. We see the invisible architecture at work, the confirmation bias in the man reading news on his phone, the anchoring bias in the woman negotiating a price, the availability heuristic in the parent clutching their child's hand, the status quo bias in the commuter taking the same route they always take. These biases aren't flaws, the narrator says softly. They're features. They're the shortcuts that allow us to navigate a complex world with limited time and cognitive resources. They're the legacy of millions of years of evolution, adaptations that kept our ancestors alive in environments very different from the one we inhabit now. But awareness is power. When we understand our biases, we can compensate for them. We can seek out information that contradicts our beliefs. We can question our first impressions. We can consider base rates and statistics instead of relying on vivid examples. We can take responsibility for our failures instead of blaming circumstances. We can recognize that our current feelings won't last forever. We can't eliminate our biases, they're too deeply wired into our neural architecture. But we can become aware of them, question them, and make better decisions despite them. We can build systems that account for our biases, checklists that force us to consider alternatives, diverse teams that challenge our assumptions, processes that slow down our thinking when speed leads us astray. We can cultivate intellectual humility, recognizing that our perceptions are not reality, that our memories are not recordings, that our judgments are not objective. The invisible architecture will always be there, shaping our thoughts in ways we can't fully perceive. But by understanding it, by naming it, by recognizing its influence, we can begin to see the world a little more clearly, think a little more accurately, and decide a little more wisely. We can't escape our biases, but we can learn to live with them, to work around them, to be a little less certain and a little more curious, a little less judgmental and a little more understanding. We can recognize that everyone else is operating under the same invisible architecture, making the same systematic errors, trapped in the same cognitive illusions. And perhaps that recognition that we're all biased, all flawed, all doing our best with imperfect mental machinery can make us a little more patient with others and a little more humble about ourselves. The human brain is the most sophisticated information processing device in the known universe. It's also a collection of shortcuts, heuristics, and biases that systematically distort our perception of reality. Both things are true, and understanding both is the beginning of wisdom.